Episode 31, Part 13, Chapter 29. Chapter 29. They found the sunken airplane in an alcove a few miles away. It must have been in a fight, for its hull was burned almost beyond recognition. There was a long, gaping lesion in the airplane's rear, made when something long and powerful had reached up and tried to snatch it out of the air. Instead it cut through the engines, making it unable to remain in the air. It was a miracle that the airplane had made it this far before it crashed into the sea. Cloud and his friends watched as the sub moved its way slowly around the airplane, trying to find a point of entry. There was a hatch on top of the airship that was probably used for attaching to other planes to refuel during flight. It seemed to be just the right size for the sub's docking hatch, and so Cloud maneuvered the submarine over airplane and carefully connected them. The two slotted together perfectly, and so the group headed down to the airplane. They were thankful to find that the lights inside the plane still worked, so they wouldn't be searching around in the dark at least. Cloud entered first, climbing down a ladder that connected to the hatch. The others came down after him and they gathered in the corridor, looking around at the wreckage.
"This is the Shinra's Gelnica-type airplane," said Cloud, recognizing a nameplate on the wall.
Looking down, he realized that the floor was wet. He looked up. Water was leaking in slowly from a cracked pipe overhead.
"I wonder why it went down here,"
he wondered to himself, and headed down the corridor. The others followed close behind. They kept quite close together, for the inside of the airplane had a very cold and ghostly atmosphere. This was not helped by their footsteps echoing as they walked, or that every so often the overhead lights would flicker and die out, leaving them in darkness. There were two doors at the end of the corridor. One of these stood open, and they moved towards it. When they reached the door they stopped. They listened. Voices could be heard in the corridor beyond, talking loudly. Cloud signaled to the others to stay where they were. Then, with one hand around the hilt of his sword, he walked through the open door. There were two men in the hallway. They were in front of a locked door at the far end of the corridor. One man was standing and supervising the other, who was kneeling in front of the door trying to unlock it. Cloud stared in surprise, recognizing the uniforms, the spiky red hair, and the shining bald head.
"Turks!"
he exclaimed. The two men fell silent. Rude stood and turned. Seeing Cloud, he raised an eyebrow.
"Again?"
he asked, and there was more surprise in his voice than there was in his face. After all, they were at the bottom of the ocean, the last place they expected to see each other.
"We just seem to keep running into each other lately,"
said Reno, almost cheerfully. He walked forward. At this point the others, who had until then remained hidden in the other corridor, ran in. They gathered behind Cloud, their weapons already drawn and ready. Reno stopped, eyeing their weapons. He then looked over his shoulder at Rude, whose only response was to adjust his shades slightly. Reno sighed and shook his head. He then gestured to the door behind him and Rude.
"There were weapons and materia developed solely to destroy Sephiroth,"
he explained to them.
"But, it was attacked by weapon and sunk to the bottom of the sea," said Rude. "I can't give you what's here,"
Reno said.
"We'll take out Sephiroth."
The Turk reached behind him and unhooked his electric rod from his belt. With a snap of his wrist the rod extended to its full length, and the tip crackled with electricity. He held it out, pointing its tip at Cloud.
"I guess this is our last meeting."
Rude stepped forward to stand beside his partner. He clenched his fists, raised them ready.
"I won't let you get in our way,"
he said. Without any warning, Reno charged forward and headed for Cloud. The swordsman barely drew the Buster sword in time before Reno swung his electric rod at Cloud's head. The rod clashed against the blade, but a game of struggle was not Reno's intent. He pressed a button on the handle with his thumb. Electricity shot across the rod, quick and powerful, spreading to the Buster sword and to the one holding it. Cloud cried out as he was thrown backward by the electric shock. He slammed into Barrett, and the two fell back into a pile of crates near the rear wall. Rude bolted past the others, intent on striking Cloud while he was down. Tifa quickly ran in front of him and blocked his path. She swung her fist and struck Rude on the chin. The blow sent Rude's head reeling backward, but he recovered quickly. He countered with a winding blow to the chest, before grabbing her outstretched arm and throwing her bodily over his shoulder. She hit the ground hard, and clutched at her head. Rude stood over her, his fist raised. He caught sight of movement to his right and quickly ducked as a bullet fired overhead. The Turk jumped over Tifa and darted forward. He grabbed hold of Vincent's arm and pushed it upward just as Vincent fired another shot, and the bullet fired harmlessly into the ceiling. Rude then tried to grab Vincent's neck, but the gunman quickly caught his other hand and struggled to keep it away from his neck. Unwilling to let Vincent struggle alone, Cat Shi hopped forward on his Mog. The Mog swung its giant fists and hit Rude in the square of his back. The Turk staggered forward, lost his balance and fell to the floor. He had barely had chance to move before Vincent's gun was at his head. The Turk stayed still, silent. Sid, meanwhile, thrust out his spear at Reno. The red-haired Turk dodged it easily, then grabbed the spear and yanked it towards him, almost pulling Sid off his feet. With the pilot off balance, Reno jabbed his rod into Sid's side, turned on the electricity, and gave the pilot a mild shock that sent him flying across the corridor. Red 13 leaped forward, hoping to latch onto Reno while his back was turned and disable his striking arm. Yet Reno had not forgotten the hound and his sharp teeth, and so quickly turned and thrust out his rod warningly. The hound stopped just inches before the crackling tip of the rod. He could feel its pulsing electricity make the fur on his face stand on end. The hound stepped back, growling fiercely. Suddenly the airplane groaned loudly, and the floor beneath their feet shuddered. The overhead lights flickered and went out, leaving them all in darkness. Yuffie cried out. The Gelnica gave another strained groan, and the lights came back on. The ground stopped shaking and became still. Reno looked over at Rude, who was still on the floor with Vincent's gun aimed squarely at his head. Rude nodded. Reno sighed and lowered his rod. The electricity on it died out, and the Turk hooked it back onto his belt.
"These guys are pretty tough,"
he said, with just a hint of sarcasm in his voice. Rude stood, keeping his arms up and palms open in a show of submission. Reno looked at Cloud, who had just risen to his feet. Cloud stared back at him. The Turk flashed him a grin and then bolted forward, running straight past the rebels and disappearing through the open door behind them. Rude stayed behind for a moment, pausing to wipe off some dirt that had gotten onto his sleeve. When he was done, he looked around at the rebels. He muttered, before following Reno out the door. Nobody tried to stop them. They simply watched as the two Turks ran down the corridor and threw themselves up the ladder, disappearing through the hatch. Cloud wondered where their sub was parked. It was probably hidden somewhere nearby, ready for moments such as this. The Turks never let down their guard, it seemed. Cloud sheathed his sword and turned to the door that Rude had been working to unlock. Time was running out for the Gelnica. If there was something that they could salvage from the steadily filling wreckage, then they should look for it now.
"So Shinra's new, secret weapon was on this airship?"
said Cloud. He approached the door and pushed a button on the console beside it. The door slid open. Rude must have just unlocked it when he and his friends interrupted them. They went on through the door. It led to a walkway overlooking a very large room that took up most of the interior of the airplane.
"This must be the cargo room,"
Cloud surmised. He leaned on the rails and looked out at the room below. Here the damage sustained by the Gelnica was at its worst. There was debris and wreckage scattered everywhere throughout the room. It looked as though nothing had escaped the crash. Wooden crates previously stocked in neat piles lay in broken heaps in all corners of the room. Barrels had fallen and burst open, spilling a strange green liquid, probably raw mako, onto the floor. The room was also very hot, as steam from burst pipes around the room seeped into the air from the engines below. As well as the crates and barrels, the Gelnica had also been issuing a Shinra standard issue helicopter. This, too, lay in ruins, smashed up in one corner of the cargo room. Its blades were dented, and one had snapped off completely. The glass in the front and sides windows had smashed and now lay hazardously all over the room. It also appeared to have been on fire at some point, for there were thin tendrils of smoke still rising from the engine. Cloud and his friends walked down the steps leading to the main bay. When he reached the bottom, he stopped and looked around at the wreckage.
"This is terrible,"
he said. He stepped off the stairs, and glass crunched under his boots.
"It's all messed up."
The bay was a terrible mess, but it was to be expected after being attacked by a weapon and then crashing into the ocean. It was also unlikely that anything the airplane had been carrying would have survived intact, unless it was very well protected. Still, while they were here, they decided that they might as well split up and search for anything that could be salvaged. Yuffie made the first find. There was a ball of Hades summon material lying on the ground near the helicopter. Hades was a powerful summon, almost as powerful as the Bahamut dragons. The ninja refused to relinquish it when Cloud asked her for it. After all, he already had the 3 Bahamuts at his disposal, she argued. Cloud decided not to argue with her, and so she pocketed her prize with a smug smile. There was little else worth taking. One crate they found was filled with cases of potions, high potions, and even elixirs for increasing the healing rate of wounds, but all of these were broken, their contents useless. After leaving the cargo room, they returned to the corridor where they first arrived, and this time went through the other door. The room that lay beyond was dark, most of the lights had broken in the crash. As they hoped, there were a few unbroken crates lying about, but the most interesting thing about the room was a large generator at the far end. It was smashed up but still operational, though it was only just clinging to life.
"What is this place?"
asked Cloud, and his voice echoed back at him.
"Must be some kind of research establishment because there's a Mako generator."
Whatever it was losing power rapidly. Mako was leaking steadily from a number of broken pipes at the side, covering the floor. At a nod from Cloud, the companions split up and began to search the contents of the crates. There were a few unbroken capsules of restorative items that were most welcome, and in one crate there was new shuriken for Yuffie, a new brand developed by Shinra known as the Conformer. The ninja's eyes lit up when she saw it and immediately snatched the weapon out of Sid's hands. It should be noted that the pilot was not particularly pleased at having his hands almost sliced off. In the end, there was little to be gained from searching the Gelnica. Most of the items that they had found ended up in Yuffie's pocket, and everyone believed that somehow she had been the one to benefit most from this little side trip. They returned to the submarine quiet and feeling irritated, and still without any clues as to the location of the key. If only the Turks hadn't run off, they could have pressed the 2 for information. Cloud took his seat in the captain's chair, yet again at a loss for what to do next. The Gelnica had turned up nothing particularly useful, nor had it provided them with any leads as to the key. It seemed that their only option was to return to the Forgotten City and speak to Bugenhagen. The old man was more reliable than Cat when it came to information, even if at times he was a bit vague about it. The swordsman turned his attention back to the console and began to detach the sub from the sunken airship. As the sub disconnected and pulled away, the airship rolled onto its side. A barrage of bubbles streamed out from the giant gash in its belly, heading towards the surface. In a matter of minutes the airship would be completely filled with water, and therefore completely inaccessible. Not that it mattered, there was nothing left anyway. Cloud turned the submarine away from the airship, preparing to head back into the ocean. The moment the sub finished turning, Cloud brought it to an immediate halt. The sudden cease of movement caused the rest of those in the sub to lose their balance, and they had to hold on to chairs and consoles to keep from falling over. Cloud heard Tifa say his name questioningly, but he did not answer her. The swordsman just stared up at the overhead screen, unable to speak. The others then saw what he had seen, and they too froze in place. They all stood, stock still, mouths slightly open in awe and fright. Only Red 13 found the courage to speak, voicing the one word they had all been dreading to hear since Cat made that subtle reference back in the underwater reactor at Janon.
"Weapon."
End of chapter. Episode 32, Part 13, Chapter 30. Chapter 30. It was a terrifying sight. Weapon was floating so close to the submarine it seemed almost possible to reach out and touch it. The sight of it stunned everyone in the sub into total silence. Only Red 13's cry broke the silence, but they were unable to tear their eyes away from the fearsome monster in front of them. The same questions ran through everyone's mind. When had Weapon found them? They had been on board the Gelnica for no longer than maybe half an hour at the most. They had to wonder, did the Turks know that Weapon was on its way? Was that why they had given up the fight so easily and fled the sunken airship? They watched as Weapon inched slowly forward. It moved by expelling air from vents in the back of its gigantic, hunching shoulders and even more gigantic legs, propelling it forward. The beast was covered from head to foot in thick, moss-colored armor, the color of which had earned it its name. The only area left uncovered by armor was a single point in its torso. Its torso was much slender than the rest of its body, with a red laser light at the center. This light was trained on the companion sub like an eye, following their every move.
"What should we do?"
asked Sid loudly. Almost as if Weapon had heard his voice, it came to a stop. They all held their breath. Weapon made no further moves forward, and they all relaxed.
"What should we do?"
Sid repeated, this time in a whisper. Cloud didn't know what to do. They were in a worse position now than they had been facing off against Ruby Weapon in the high wind. At least then they had room to move about, and could use their weapons and materia. Here they could use neither. They were trapped in a cramped, metallic crate at the bottom of the ocean, with nothing left to use but a few missiles.
"Should we run?"
Tifa asked.
"It's all we can do,"
answered Cloud. He took hold of the control stick.
"Hold on."
He jerked the control stick towards him. The submarine roared into life and sprang forward at speed, charging towards weapon. Cloud tugged on the control stick again and the submarine lurched upwards, rising in a steep climb towards weapon's head. The submarine did not stop and climbed ever higher, until finally it soared up and over Emerald Weapon's head. Once over the beast's head, Cloud thrust the control stick forward and sent the submarine whizzing through the water, heading for the alcove's exit. They broke through the exit and headed back out into the ocean, leaving Emerald Weapon behind.
"You did it, Cloud,"
said Tifa joyfully, once she and the others had regained their balance after the sudden burst of speed. She looked to Cloud, expecting him to be as relieved as she was. She was surprised, then, to find that Cloud's face was solemn as he stared up at the screen.
"What is it?"
she asked. She soon got her answer. The sonar beside her beeped loudly, just as Emerald Weapon emerged from the alcove's entrance. The monstrous weapon slid out of the alcove, moving slow and steady, like something out of a nightmare. It turned slightly to the left and to the right, searching. Then its gaze settled on the sub and it began to move towards them. Vincent was sitting at the weapons station. Upon seeing weapon, the gunman turned calmly to the controls and loaded a missile into the bay. He fired it, and everyone watched as the missile sped through the water towards weapon. The missile struck the beast in its shoulder, and as it exploded the area became filled with bubbles and thick, watery smoke. Everyone watched, hopeful. Their hopes were in vain. The watery cloud parted as weapon emerged, undamaged and unharmed. The missile had done nothing to damage its armor, or even hinder its progression. The only change they noticed was in weapon's speed. It had picked up its pace.
Vincent, I think you just made it angry,"
said Yuffie. Vincent said nothing. Cloud moved the sub around a tall pillar of rock. He knew the purpose of Vincent's attack on weapon. The gunman had simply been confirming what Cloud had already suspected, that the submarine's arsenal was not suited to an underwater battle with Emerald Weapon. The missiles had been designed to penetrate other enemy ships, not the thick, impenetrable armor of weapon. In short, if it came to a battle, they stood very little chance of winning. They came around the other side of the pillar. Now all that lay before them was the wide, open ocean, with nowhere they could hide from weapon. Where should they go? Cloud had to think quickly, for weapon was steadily gaining on them. After making up his mind, he turned the sub to the right. Perhaps they could lose weapon along the pillars and crevices that lined the ocean floor by the continent walls. Almost as soon as the sub began to turn, Emerald Weapon came to a stop. The red light in the middle of its frame flashed once. It lifted its giant shoulders up, and then fired 2 shots from 2 of the 4 holes in the front of its shoulders. The projectiles fired through the water at great speed and passed the sub on its right-hand side. The shockwave made by the bullets zipping past caused the submarine to careen sharply to the left. For those inside, it was all they could do to keep from falling over as the ground beneath them lurched and tilted sideways. Only Cloud remained in his chair, pulling on the control stick as hard as he could, trying to bring the submarine back under his control. The submarine groaned as it rolled back onto its belly. Cloud immediately turned the sub around and headed north along the eastern shore. He put as much power into the engines as he could, forcing the sub forward before weapon could have a chance to fire again. They had to bring some distance between them and weapon if they were going to have a chance at surviving this. Seeing the sub turn towards the north, Emerald Weapon slowly came to a stop. It lowered its shoulders, expelling hot air from the vents along its back. It opened its mouth, mostly hidden behind the armor covering its face, releasing another small stream of hot bubbles. Then it closed its mouth again and began to shuffle forwards after the companion sub. It moved at a steady pace, keeping the sub in its sight. Cloud steered the sub in a long arc towards the eastern shore. The current was strong this far down and Cloud had to fight to keep the sub moving at a steady pace, so as not to draw weapon's attention. His eyes watched the continent walls closely, searching for an inlet where they could quickly hide and then rise to the surface. There was one such inlet just ahead, but the moment Cloud made to turn the sub towards it, weapon fired another round of projectiles on its left-hand side. The shots hit the continent walls and smashed the entrance of the inlet to pieces, blocking it with falling rock. Cloud cursed and turned the sub back to the north. The sub continued to head north for a further 10 minutes, with Emerald Weapon remaining in close pursuit the whole time. It did not draw any closer to them, but any time they tried to turn and slip into another inlet or cave, weapon fired another round that forced them back onto their northward course. Eventually they passed the northernmost point of the eastern continent and headed out into the ocean. As they drew closer to the northern continent, the temperature of the water outside the sub began to drop rapidly. The air inside the sub became cold, until their breath came out in small, white clouds. They were very thankful for the heaters that provided them with warmth and kept them from freezing. Cloud just hoped that Weapon would give up the chase and leave them soon, before the engines froze up. It was not long before the walls of the northern continent came into view. Upon seeing this, Cloud cursed to himself. Now they would have to turn and risk being shot at by Weapon, otherwise they would collide with the continent walls. He took a deep breath before he turned the submarine cautiously to the left. Seeing the submarine move, Emerald Weapon immediately fired another shot. Cloud saw it coming and immediately swerved the submarine to the right. The sub turned and began to rush along the continent walls, heading west. Weapon started to give chase, no longer keeping its distance and moving at high speed after the fleeing sub. 2 missiles fired from the sub's rear as Vincent tried to stall the monster's advance. The missiles struck Weapon in its torso but did nothing to slow it down. The beast just kept on coming.
"It's still coming after us!"
cried Cat, cowering in fear on his Mog. Cloud pulled on the control stick and pulled the submarine sharply to the right. A loud explosion sounded right next to them, and the submarine was thrown harshly back. Weapon was determined to not let them escape into the ocean again. Looking up at the view screen, the rear camera showed Weapon fast approaching. Its image was growing rapidly as it drew closer, until it filled the screen. He saw the light in the center of its torso begin to glow hotly. Knowing what was coming, Cloud pushed the submarine forward as fast as it could go, praying that the engines would hold. They had to escape before it unleashed its primary weapon. Then, as they sped along, Cloud spotted an opening in the continent walls. Recalling the maneuver he pulled when they had fought the other Shinra sub, he pulled the sub into a sharp turn. The nose remained where it was while the rear kept on turning, until the sub had almost made a complete 180-degree turn. Quickly, Cloud scanned the continent wall. There it was, a tall, narrow fissure in the rocky walls, rising from the ground and heading up to the surface. It was too narrow for the likes of Weapon to fit through, but it was just wide enough for the submarine. Seeing another barrage of rounds heading their way, Cloud punched the accelerator and headed for the fissure. They reached the fissure just as the rounds exploded. The blast caused a shockwave that sent the submarine hurtling down the narrow gap. More than once they came perilously close to crashing into the walls. It was all Cloud could do to steer them away from the walls, leaving them with nothing more than a few meager scrapes. Weapon roared and tried to follow the sub into the fissure. As expected, its great bulk was too large and so it was unable to enter after them. Realizing that it had lost its prey, Weapon roared in anger, its rage so intense that it made the water quiver. Cloud kept the sub moving down the length of the fissure. Weapon could not make it down here, of that he was sure. But it still had its primary weapon, that laser. With that, Emerald Weapon could blast the rock guarding the fissure to pieces, and then they would have no escape. All they could do now was move well out of range and hope that Weapon did not use its laser. Perhaps once it realized that the chase was futile it would leave and they could quietly make an escape. The fissure came to an abrupt end about 30 meters ahead of them, but as they neared, Cloud saw that there was a darkened tunnel close to the ocean floor. Here was the perfect hiding place. Cloud led the submarine into the tunnel and brought it to a stop. Then they waited. In the distance they heard Weapon roaring in rage. It was incredible that they could still hear it, this far beneath the ocean, when the water should have dulled out all other sounds. Every so often they heard a thud, presumably caused by Weapon slamming its body against the fissure's entrance, trying to draw them out.
"So now what?"
Barrett asked, breaking the silence.
"We used to sit here and wait for it to leave." "It looks that way,"
Cloud replied, not looking at him. Silence resumed. Outside, Weapon continued to slam its body against the rock. Barrett, growing more and more impatient, drummed his fingers against his gun arm. A few minutes passed by, and still Weapon showed no signs of stopping. Unable to take it any longer, Barrett slammed his gun arm against the wall.
"Why don't we use charge it?"
he demanded.
"All this waitin' around is driving me crazy."
He slammed his arm against the wall a second time for good measure.
"As long as Weapon is out there, we'll be blasted out of the water the moment we show our faces,"
said Vincent gruffly. When Barrett seemed about to protest, Vincent added,
"If you want to go out there and die, then go ahead. What will become of the planet then? Or Marlene?"
Barrett shut his mouth. He shook his fist at Vincent and then turned away, his face sullen.
"Guess I'll just wait, then,"
he said finally. Once again the silence returned. Everyone in the sub sat nervously as they listened to Weapon roaring, their hearts racing each time they heard the telltale thud of its body crashing into the rock. Inwardly, each one of them hoped that the continent walls were strong enough to withstand the force, though none dared to say it aloud. After about 5 minutes of silence, Tifa slipped off her headphones and left her seat to stand beside Cloud.
How much air do we have left?
She asked him quietly, so the others couldn't hear.
About an hour,
the swordsman whispered back.
It should be enough, I think.
You hope, Tifa amended softly. She looked down at the floor, her fists trembling. Angrily, she pushed her fears aside and looked up at the screen.
Where are we, anyway?
She asked aloud, trying to change the topic. Cloud brought the world map up onto the screen. Their location was marked by a single yellow dot.
We're in an underwater tunnel on the southern side of the northern continent,
he said.
It isn't marked on the map.
Cloud nodded. As far as the map was concerned, they appeared to be inside the continent itself.
I guess nobody knew about it until now.
The swordsman cancelled the world map and returned to the view screen. He pressed another button to turn on the outside lights, which lit up the surrounding area. As long as they were trapped down here, they may as well have a look around. The tunnel that they were hiding in was very dark, so dark that even the lights had difficulty penetrating it. The walls were narrow, with barely enough room to turn around. It also seemed that the tunnel headed further underneath the continent, though to where it led, Cloud couldn't even guess.
Well, we might as well have a look where this leads, he said to the others. Before some people go crazy.
He added with a smirk, ignoring Barrett's shaking fist. Cloud began to guide the sub slowly down the dark tunnel. The sound of roaring and slamming became quieter and quieter the further down the tunnel they went. All traces of sunlight were extinguished down here. The only source of light came from the sub, and even that was faint compared to the overwhelming darkness. Then, the sonar blipped. Tifa went back to her console and sat down, pulling the headphones back over her ears. Curious, she watched the screen. The sonar beeped again, a little louder this time, and a small dot appeared on the screen. The fighter raised an eyebrow. There was definitely something there, some way ahead.
Hang on a second, she said. I'm picking something up. Keep heading straight ahead, Cloud.
Cloud did as she told him. He slowed the submarine down until it was inching its way through the tunnel. Everyone kept their eyes on the view screen, scanning the pebbly ground outside, searching for signs of something. The sonar began to beep rapidly, just as something came into view of the screen.
What's that?
He said. He brought the sub to a stop and looked up at the screen. There was an object there, sticking up out of the rock just a few meters ahead of the sub. Cloud inched the sub a little further forward to bring it into clear view of the lights. Then his breath caught in his throat and he stared in disbelief at the object. It was a wooden stick, jammed tight into the rock. It was almost perfectly straight and had numerous branches growing out of it at intervals that were too well positioned to be pure coincidence. It looked very old and very delicate, in fact they were surprised it hadn't rotted away by now. Cloud thought it resembled one of those old-fashioned music box keys. A musical key. Cloud rose out of his chair, his eyes fixed on the stick.
Do you think it's...
He began, but couldn't finish for fear he might curse it. Nobody said a word. They waited in nervous anticipation as Cloud maneuvered the sub until it was positioned over the key. The hatch on the underside opened and the grabber claw descended. The claw's fingers closed gently around the key, hooking beneath the branches, and began to pull it carefully out of the rock. Everyone held their breath as the claw pulled, terrified that the key might snap. The key moved slowly and eventually slid out of the rocks, intact. Everyone sighed heavily. The claw carried the key into the sub, and the hatch closed behind it. The computer hummed, analyzing the key.
Analysis completed.
The computer said after a moment.
Exact date of origin cannot be determined. Estimated to be several thousand years old. Key of the Ancients.
Cloud breathed. His heart was racing with the tension. The swordsman sank back into his chair, took a deep breath, and sighed heavily. He didn't know why, but he just knew that this was the key they had been searching for. How it had ended up buried this far beneath the ocean he would never know, but that didn't matter now. What mattered was that, at last, they had found the key. They were so thrilled about having found the key of the Ancients that they totally forgot about Emerald Weapon. They only remembered when they reached the entrance to the fissure and quickly slowed their pace, looking to see if Weapon was still there waiting for them to emerge. To their surprise, Emerald Weapon had gone. There was no sign of the beast anywhere in the surrounding area, even the sonar showed no signs of it. They took this as a good sign and quickly made their escape, though more than a few of them began to wonder about Weapon's true intentions when it had chased them across the ocean. They headed with all haste back to Junon, where they had left the high wind. Stepping out of the sub into the sunlight and open air filled them with such indescribable relief that they had to stop for a moment to appreciate the feeling of the wind against their skin. The moment was dampened only by the sight of meteor in the sky, reminding them of their mission. They transported the key with the utmost care onto the airship. It was much stronger than it looked, but they did not want to risk damaging it now, after all they had gone through to find it. Once it was fastened securely in the hold, they headed with all possible speed back to the northern continent. They landed the high wind once more outside of Bone Village. When they were preparing to disembark, Cat Shi suddenly announced that he would be staying behind. When asked why, the cat simply replied that he had some maintenance to take care of. Cloud decided not to press him on the issue, and so they left the cat on board the high wind and headed on to the Forgotten City. Bugenhagen was where they had left him, waiting patiently beside the altar. When he saw the companions approach carrying the key, his old face creased into a smile.
"Oh. You found it,"
he said, and Cloud was irked to register some surprise in the old man's voice. Had he really doubted their ability to find it on their own? The old man took the key from Cloud. He turned it over in his hands, examining it closely. He felt the wood, old and damp, but firm. He ran his fingers along the branches. Yes, this was indeed the key that the ancients' writing had spoken of. Bugenhagen nodded in satisfaction and waved his hand towards a strange structure on a small platform on the other side of the chamber.
"That music box over there," he said. "We'll put the key in it."
He started to float away, but then stopped.
"I'll go use the key," he told the companions. "You all wait here. And watch closely what happens."
They all watched as Bugenhagen left the altar and floated towards the platform. He stopped next to the strange structure that he had pointed out to them. It was made up of numerous rising crystal spikes of various sizes, all positioned loosely around a tiny hole in the rock. Next to this music box, as Bugenhagen had called it, was a tall, cylindrical pillar of rock. Carefully Bugenhagen lifted the key and then lowered it gently into the middle of the box. The key's tip slotted into the hole with a gentle click, locking into place. Bugenhagen then let go of the key. It remained perfectly upright, its branches positioned perfectly between the numerous crystal spires.
"Ho ho ho!"
Bugenhagen chuckled, and stepped back to watch. The key started to turn. As it moved, the branches hit the many crystal spires, which rang out with a soft, high-pitched note. The more the key turned, the more notes rang out throughout the chamber, playing an intricate yet beautiful melody. As the song came to a close, there was a gentle rumble from deep beneath the audience chamber. The pillar next to the music box trembled and then slid down into the ground, like a switch that had just been turned on. There was another rumble, this time from above the chamber. Everyone turned their eyes to the hole in chamber roof as a few droplets of water trickled through. Then a torrent of water flowed through the hole and descended upon the stone platform. It fell like a curtain over the altar, hiding the crystal and the slab from view. A moment later, a bright glow began to shine from within the wall of water. Tifa walked to the edge of the path, stopping before the waterfall. The water was crystal clear, she could see her reflection almost perfectly. She stretched out her hand and let the water slide onto her fingertips. It was deliciously cool against her skin, and the sunlight streaming in from above gave the water a shattered diamond effect. It was beautiful. Bugenhagen floated up beside them, also admiring the waterfall.
"Now, go inside,"
the old man told them.
"Hope may be inside." Or.
He did not finish his sentence. He did not need to. They all knew what or meant. Cloud stepped up to the edge of the wall. He, too, placed his hand into the wall, letting the water splash onto his hands, his gloves, and his materia. It was just water. The swordsman stepped through the water until he came out of the other side, inside the barrier made by the water. He shook his head, shaking the water out of his spiky hair. The others came through after him, until all were gathered around the altar. Bugenhagen came through last and immediately moved to float beside the crystal. The crystal was glowing now. Its light filled the altar, reflecting off the water and casting its image about the water's surface. Bugenhagen watched as his own reflection danced about on the water, ever shifting. As the light began to gather at a single point on the water, realization dawned in the old man's eyes.
"This was just a screen to project an image,"
he announced. He turned to Cloud and the others, who looked up at him in bewilderment.
Look!
He told them, pointing up at the waterfall.
Look at the image projected on the screen of the water.
They did as he bade them and looked up at the water. At first they saw nothing, just the rippling reflection of the crystal. Then, as the light gathered, an image began to form. Cloud's eyes widened as he recognized the face now showing on the water. It was Eris. The ancient was inside the city of the ancients, the forgotten homeland of her predecessors. She was kneeling at the center of the altar, her head lowered, eyes closed, and her hands clasped across her chest. Her lips moved voicelessly, as she prayed with all her heart for the one hope that could save the planet from meteor. Cloud watched the image in disbelief. Eris looked so alive and so real. Suddenly Eris lifted her head. She looked directly ahead of her, which, incidentally, was right at Cloud and the others. Her face softened into a smile, as though she was truly alive and was happy to have seen them again. Then Eris was falling, as Sephiroth's blade left her body and took her life along with it. Her head dropped low and her eyes fluttered shut. They heard her last breath as it left her, soft and painless. Her pink silk ribbon, the one that she always wore, came loose and slipped from her hair. There it was. The white materia. Now free from the ribbon, the white materia fell onto the altar. When it hit the floor it bounced with a light clang. It did not stop but continued to bounce from pillar to pillar, until at last it fell from the final pillar and plunged into the water that lay at the foot of the city. It slipped quickly through the water, until it finally reached the bottom. It came to a stop, nestled among a pile of pebbles. And then, as it lay still among the pebbles, the white materia began to glow. Holy had heard Eris's prayer. End of chapter. Episode 33, Part 13, Chapter 31. Chapter 31. Cloud gazed up in wonder at the vision on the screen.
It's glowing,
he breathed.
Ho ho ho!
Bugenhagen chuckled.
It's pale green.
Cloud walked up to the edge of the altar. Reaching up, he placed his hand against the bottom of the screen. The image rippled at his touch. The white materia was shrouded in an aura of pale green light, just as they had hoped it would be. The light it gave was gentle. It did not pulse or flash, nor did it emanate overwhelming power like its dark counterpart. It just shone, softly and gently. This was Eris's final gift.
Eris,
said Cloud.
Eris has already prayed for Holy.
He let his hand fall back to his side, and the water fell smoothly once again.
After I gave up the black materia to Sephiroth, Eris's words came into my dreams. She said, she was the only one who could stop Sephiroth. And to do that, there was a secret here. That was Holy. That's why, she had the white materia. Eris knew about here.
Cloud continued, waving his hand to encompass the chamber and the rest of the city,
and what she had to do. Eris has left us a great hope. But, it cost her her life. Her future.
The swordsman looked up towards the roof of the chamber, where the water was still streaming in around the altar.
I'm sorry. Eris,
he said.
I should have figured this out sooner. You left without saying a word. It was all so sudden, so I couldn't think. That's why it took so long for me to find out. But, Eris. I understand now. Eris. I'll do the rest.
The only response Cloud got was the sound of the water as it splashed down from above onto the rocks below. He could only hope that, somewhere, Eris had heard his words. Cloud felt a hand touch his shoulder, and he looked at Tifa, beside him.
You mean, we?
She corrected him, grinning widely.
What Eris left for us,
said Red 13.
We can't let it go to waste.
Cloud looked around at his friends, all of whom concurred with the Hound. Eris's sacrifice had given them the hope they needed to stop meteor from falling and save the planet. Cloud spread his arms wide and looked up at the sky.
Thank you, Eris.
One by one, everyone turned their own eyes to look up at the sky. Sunlight was streaming in through the hole in the ceiling, filling the altar with light. The light danced off the falling water and the surface of the crystal in the center of the altar. The mood must have been getting to them, for they could almost feel Eris smiling down at them, thankful that her prayer had finally reached them. Cloud lowered his arms.
Ares's voice has already reached the planet,
he told them.
Just look at the glow of the white materia. But...
A troubling thought occurred to him and he paused.
How about Holy? How come Holy isn't moving?
The swordsman shook his head in puzzlement.
Why? Something's getting in its way,
replied Bugenhagen gravely. A frown passed over Cloud's face. Something was getting in Holy's way. Or, rather, someone was getting in its way. There was only one person on the planet Cloud could think of who had the power to stop Holy from moving.
Him,
said Cloud in a low voice.
He's the only one that could do it.
The others reached the same conclusion, and they shifted about uncomfortably. Cloud looked up at the sky once more and clenched his fists.
Sephiroth! Where are you?
The image of the white materia faded, and the companions left the altar. The water continued to fall even after they left. They gathered on the upper tier, silent. They had their answer from the white materia, Holy was ready to move. But as long as Sephiroth lived, it would not be able to move. Cloud was just about to ask his friends what they should do next, when a loud ring broke the silence and made them jump.
What they?
Asked Cloud, startled. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the PHS. He answered it. There came a shuffling sound on the other end, and then Cat's voice came through. His voice was low, barely a whisper.
Sorry, I was a little surprised. What happened?
Cloud asked, just as quietly.
You remember when the Junon cannon disappeared? Actually, Rufus moved it.
Cloud's brow creased in thought. What was Cat talking about? Then it came back to him. It had been when they passed through Junon on their way to the underwater reactor. On the docks, Cloud had felt that there had been something different about the town. Something had been missing. At the time Cloud could not put his finger on it, but now that Cat had pointed it out, it became obvious what was missing. It was the cannon. But what was this talk of Rufus moving it?
Moved it?
He asked, shaking his head.
That big thing? Where? Why? Rufus wants to destroy Sephiroth with it,
the cat whispered back. The shuffling sound came again, and Cat fell silent. When it passed, he spoke again.
That cannon operates on huge materia. But the huge materia has already been used in the rocket plan. So since the cannon's useless right now, he's decided to move it to a place where materia.
The cat paused.
No, where Mako is gathered.
He corrected. Something about the way the cat hesitated before answering gave Cloud a bad feeling in the pit of his stomach.
And where is that?
He demanded. Midgar, known as the Mako City, or the floating city in the sky. It was the place where it all began. Time once knew it as the City of Dreams. People came from all across the world to live and find work in the great, Mako-powered city. The people above the plate had lived comfortable lives, provided by the Mako energy that the Shinra Company supplied. And the citizens always knew that they would be safe, protected by the Shinra Company's army and its prized military, soldier. Now, the city was completely different. The Shinra Company's officials had declared a state of emergency, and the army had been dispatched into the city to control the growing unrest. A helicopter flew around the main headquarters at all times, keeping a constant vigil. The entrance to the building was heavily guarded, preventing anyone from entering the building. It had taken the Shinra army a while to disperse the crowds of angry and terrified civilians that had gathered outside the main building. They had come in droves, demanding that President Rufus come out and face up to what he and his company had done to the planet. The Junon cannon had been placed on the northern side of the city, at the edge of Sector 8. Scaffold had been hastily erected to support the gigantic barrel, which was pointing to the north in the direction of the northern continent. Pipes had been secured to outlets on the Mako reactors separating the city's 8 sectors, leading to a power generator at the base of the cannon. At the designated time, these pipes would draw Mako energy straight from the reactors and feed it into the cannon. The cannon, when activated, would fire shells of Mako with such power and strength that they would traverse the vast ocean to the northern continent. Heidegger, head of the security department, had ordered that a barrier of soldiers and machinery be placed around the perimeter of Shinra headquarters. He also dispatched the Turks at various places inside and below the building. He did this, he had said, to protect Shinra employees still inside the building. However, this was just a ruse, as many employees had now realized. Heidegger did not care one jot about the safety of the rest of the Shinra employees. All these precautions, as he had so eloquently put it, were there to protect the high-ranking officials, such as himself and Scarlet. And as they realized further, the soldiers and Turks had not been put in place just to prevent the civilians from breaking in, they were also there to prevent employees from getting out. Someone once said that there was a high price to pay in order to leave Shinra. Many employees were now beginning to realize just how high that price was. In the president's office on the upper levels of the Shinra building, Rufus was holding what he hoped would not be his last meeting as president of the Shinra company. The situation had become grave. Their attempts to win back the support of the citizens by destroying Meteor had failed. His company was falling apart around his ears, employees were deserting left and right. The shadow of the Genova project hung as largely over them as Meteor did in the sky. But Rufus knew that there was no turning back now. All he could do was focus all of his attention on the one last chance that the Shinra company had for survival. They had to focus all of the company's efforts and power and put an end to Sephiroth's shadow.
That's why, Reeve,
the president said to the head of the urban development department.
It's your job to adjust the reactor's output.
Reeve Tusty shifted uncomfortably.
I see,
he said, after a moment's thought. He looked down at the ground, torn. He did not like this plan. Scarlet laughed loudly at Reeve's troubled face.
Don't worry about adjusting it, Reeve,
she said to him, her voice mocking. Her lips twisted into a smile.
Once you open it up all the way, everything will go full speed.
Reeve looked at her. Even now, Scarlet was still sickeningly smug and cold. Now it was Heidegger's turn to laugh.
The president's sure done it this time. If we can only defeat Sephiroth, the idea that Meteor will also disappear is based on different objectives.
He stroked his beard, equally smug.
Please remember, Mr. President,
Scarlet added quickly with a look at Rufus.
It was my idea to fire Mako reactor-powered shells.
Once again, Reeve shuffled about. Were these two still more concerned about petty things like scoring points and their own personal gain more than the safety of the people or the planet? Reeve turned slightly away from the two of them, hands clenching and unclenching, lost in thought. Rufus, too, seemed more preoccupied with other things.
Will the shells really reach the northern border?
He asked Scarlet.
Of course,
replied Scarlet confidently. She cackled to herself. She walked over to the window and began to inspect her nails.
But Mr. President, please do not call it a Mako cannon. This new weapon will be called the Sister Ray.
Reeve sighed heavily. The name of the cannon made little difference to the job it was being remodeled to do. Yet clearly it mattered to Scarlet, who wanted every bit of credit for the plan. If it wasn't for the fact that the cannon was being used as their last shot to destroy Sephiroth, Reeve would hope that it blew up in her pretty face. He looked at the president. Rufus's brow was creased with concern, and his fingers drummed lightly against the edge of the table. Even Rufus had his doubts about this plan, Reeve realized. Scarlet's plan was a risky one, and if it failed then Midgar would be completely defenseless against a weapon attack. But it was the company's only remaining option, so Rufus would have no choice but to give it a try. The meeting went on. As it continued, Reeve began to grow more and more uneasy. His fists tightened and he clenched his teeth. What should he do? After Cat's call, Cloud and the others hurried back through the sleeping forest towards Bone Village. They tried to move as quickly as possible, but Bugenhagen's older body was not able to keep up and so they were forced to slow down. When they reached Bone Village, they came across a miner who was preparing to set sail for the western continent. He agreed to take Bugenhagen back with him. The old man gave his thanks and goodbyes and wished them luck in their endeavor. Cloud tried to persuade the old man to come with them, but Bugenhagen insisted that his presence would only serve as a distraction if they went into battle. He tried not to look at Red 13 as he said this, but the Hound, remembering his folly in their battle against Ruby Weapon, hung his head in shame. They left Bugenhagen in Bone Village and hurried back to the Highwind. Cat Shi was waiting for them on the outer deck. He jumped and waved and called for them to hurry up. The companions picked up the pace and ran towards the airship. As they neared it, Cloud suddenly stopped and looked around. There was something different about the air. It was strangely still and quiet, and had an almost ominous feeling. He muttered curiously. Sid and the others reached the Highwind. They gathered around the foot of the ladder leading up to the outer deck where Cat was waiting for them. They did not seem to notice the strange lack of anything in the air. Cloud continued to look around. Tifa spotted him and called out to him. Her voice broke Cloud from his thoughts. It was probably nothing, just his mind playing tricks on him. He forced his worries out of his mind and ran to catch up with the others. He had no sooner reached the airship than the ground began to shake. It came so suddenly and so violently that the swordsman was thrown onto his knees. The ground lurched up at him, throwing him off balance. He heard the others also cry out, as they, too, were thrown aside by the quake. Cloud raised his head. The high wind was rocking from side to side as the quake shook it from its engine to its propellers. The airship groaned and the engines hummed loudly as the crew tried to lift the airship away from the ground and away from the quake. Behind him, Cloud heard a loud rip as one of the trees from the nearby forest was ripped up by its roots and came crashing down. The quake raged on, showing no signs of stopping.
What they?
Cloud cried. The earthquake's epicenter was a few miles away from where they were, at the entrance of a large inlet on the southeastern side of the continent. The water began to heave from a point deep beneath the surface. It swelled and then burst upward as something tall and immeasurably large rose up from where it had been resting deep beneath the water. Something had awoken it, and now it had risen to the surface. It was yet another weapon. This one was known as Diamond Weapon. Its name did not come from its armor, which was dull, metallic silver, but by the clearness of its eyes, which glinted like diamonds in the sunlight. It stood more than 15 meters tall, and had a girth that was almost as long. It had gigantic legs the size of old oak trees and large, flat feet ending in 5 massive, sharp claws. Its arms were small in comparison, but its arms were not where its strength lay. Diamond Weapon's main strength lay in the 2 giant, wing-like protrusions rising out of the back of its shoulder blades. These opened and closed at the front, hiding a set of small cannons inside its own body. A red light glowed at the center of its torso and this pulsed madly as it rose out of the water. As the last of the water slipped down its body, Diamond Weapon opened its jaws as wide as they could go and roared loudly. Its roar was piercing and made the water around it tremble. The beast looked around for a moment, before its gaze turned southwards. It flexed its hands, and its eyes flashed hungrily. Then Weapon began to move forward through the water, heading south. Cloud and the others knew nothing of Weapon's appearance in the neighboring inlet. When the quake ended they hurried onto the high wind, preparing to head to Midgar to see if they could find out anything more about Shinra's new weapon. The information Cat had given them was limited, and they had to know if it was something they had to put a stop to before it was put into action. The airship had just risen off the ground when the consoles in the bridge began to crackle with the piercing sound of static. Sid turned to a crewman on the nearest console.
"What's wrong?"
he demanded angrily.
"It's a strange signal,"
the crewman reported. Sid looked around the bridge. The static was affecting all of the consoles on the bridge. It was loud and buzzed in everyone's ears. Yuffie clamped her hands over ears. Red 13, with his finer hearing, ducked his head low and shook his head, whimpering. Sid turned back to the crewman.
"From where?"
he asked. The crewman nodded and turned to his scanner to locate the source of the static. When the report came up he frowned in puzzlement. He performed the scan again but the report came up with the same result. This couldn't be right. He did the scan a 3rd time, in case the static had affected the scanner. He got the same result.
"It's coming from this person,"
he said, turning to look at Cat. Everyone turned to Cat. The cat looked back at them and tilted his head to one side, mystified as to why everybody was staring at him like that. The sound of the static came again, this time louder and more intense. Suddenly the cat's body stiffened, and then both he and his mog jerked violently.
"Wow!"
Cat exclaimed. His body relaxed, released from whatever strange force had suddenly gripped it. He shook his head. That was bizarre. For a moment, he had almost lost control of himself. Good thing it had passed. The mog then abruptly leaped forward, almost throwing the cat off its head. Cat tried to hold onto it, but his body shuddered again and he rolled onto his back, arms and legs twitching.
"Hey!"
he cried. The mog hopped from foot to foot, and then began to spin slowly on the spot. Cloud and the rest of the companions stared in astonishment as Cat and his mog hopped about the bridge. It seemed as though the static was short-circuiting them both, causing them to move erratically. There was nothing they could do but watch as the cat struggled to bring both himself and his mog back under his control. Finally the static ceased, and the cat and mog both came to a sudden stop. The cat flopped forward on the mog's head and laid there, his body still. The others watched, unsure of what to do. Cloud was just about to step forward to see if Cat was okay when the cat suddenly bolted upright, making everybody jump. The cat plunked himself down on the mog's head and brushed himself down.
That was a surprise,
the cat commented, so casually he made it seem like nothing had happened.
The controls went crazy.
He finished brushing himself down and began to adjust his crown. The mog, too, made a show of cleaning itself up. Once the two of them were done, Cat led the mog forward to the others.
This ain't good,
he told them.
Weapon came out of the sea and is heading straight for Midgar. The new weapon should stop him, right?
Cloud asked him. Cat scratched his chin.
I don't know if it's ready or not. Hey.
Barrett pushed his way past Cloud and ran up to Cat.
What's gonna happen to Marlene?
He demanded of the cat, the muscles in his neck twitching in anger. Cloud almost hit himself. Of course, Marlene was still in Midgar. With everything that had happened, he had completely forgotten about little Marlene. The girl had been taken prisoner by the Shinra along with Elmira, Ares' adoptive mother. Cat had used the situation to ensure that he continued to travel with Cloud and the others, with the proviso that if they let him travel with them, Marlene would stay safe. So far he had kept his word.
Don't you worry none,
said Cat with a grin.
Marlene's in a safe place. She's with Ares' mama.
Barrett did not find this reassuring. All he could think of was that Marlene was still in the hands of the Shinra, and it angered him. It did not matter how many times Cat assured him that Marlene was safe until he could hold her in his arms, he could not believe in Cat. His anger swelled. He walked away from Cat, scratching his head. Cat Shi saw this and frowned crossly.
Barrett!
He snapped. He made the Mog leap forward to catch up with him, and stopped beside him. The cat stood up on the Mog and crossed his arms.
What was that scratching just now?
He demanded, his whiskers bristling.
As long as Marlene's safe, who cares what else happens, right?
Barrett did not reply. Cat Shi sighed heavily. As he had thought, Marlene's safety was the only thing Barrett cared about. Never mind that there were thousands of other people living in Midgar at this very moment, all of them facing the very same danger. Cat Shi sat down on the Mog's head and sagged, his ears drooping low.
I've been itching to say this to you for a while now,
said Cat. He looked up at Barrett.
When you blew the Midgar #1 up, how many folks do you think died?
Barrett shuffled uncomfortably. He refused to look at Cat.
That was for the life of the planet,
he mumbled in a low voice.
You gotta expect a few casualties. A few.
The cat repeated. He shook his head.
What y'all mean a few? What may be a few to y'all is everything to them who died. Protect the planet? Ha!
This time the cat's anger was directed at everyone. He looked around at them all, from Cloud to Tifa, from Tifa to Sid and so on, sparing no one.
Y'all sure sound good. Ain't no one that'd go against ya. So ya think ya can do whatever y'all want?
Now Barrett turned and glared at the cat fiercely.
I don't wanna hear that from no one in Shinra,
he said. He clenched his fist. Cat sighed again and sagged down low on the Mog's head.
Nothing I can do about that?
He replied, with a touch of regret. Tifa looked at Cloud desperately, silently pleading with him to stop this argument before it grew out of hand. It would be difficult to continue the journey if they started to fall out now, even if it was something that had been long coming. Cloud, too, had had enough of this argument. When Barrett raised his fist and started to walk toward the miserable-looking cat, he snapped.
Stop it!
He ordered sharply. Barrett did as he was told and lowered his fists. He turned away from Cat Shi and stared out the window, refusing to look at him or anyone else. Cat, too, could not bring himself to look at anyone. He looked completely and utterly dejected, his ears drooping. Even the Mog looked sad, its feet shuffling on the floor. An awkward silence fell. Nobody knew what to say that would break the icy tension. Eventually Tifa stepped forward to brave the storm. She walked over to Cat Shi and leaned down in front of him, looking up at his sad, furry face.
Cat,
she said softly.
Barrett, he knows what he did. What we did in Midgar can't be forgotten no matter what the reason. Right? We haven't forgotten, right?
She looked at Cloud. The swordsman nodded. Yes, he remembered the things that they had done in Midgar. Barrett could call it freedom fighting if he wanted, but in reality it was just plain terrorism done in hate of the Shinra.
I know you,
Tifa continued, looking back at Cat.
I know you can't quit the company because you're worried about the people in Midgar, right?
Cat turned his head to look at her. She met his gaze and nodded firmly. Slowly, the cat smiled. Perhaps he was right about this group, after all. Seeing his smile, Tifa stood up straight and turned to Cloud.
Cloud,
she said. Cloud nodded and turned to the rest of the group.
Okay,
he said in a loud voice, breaking the somber silence.
Let's go. We'll beat Weapon ourselves. Hey, Cloud.
Sid interrupted him, a little uneasy.
You think we can win against that monster? We got a chance of winning, right? How would I know?
Replied Cloud with a shrug.
But that's no reason for us to just let him go.
Sid scratched his head. The swordsman had a point. Cloud turned to the window.
We're going to Midgar and fight Weapon,
he said.
Come on, let's move.
End of chapter. Episode 34, Part 13, Chapter 32. Chapter 32. It was decided shortly after takeoff that instead of heading straight to Midgar, the Highwind would make a short trip east to find Weapon. The pilot followed Cat's directions, leading them to the area where Weapon was reported to have surfaced. They found Diamond Weapon just as it was leaving the inlet. The monster was making its way steadily through the water, heading in the direction of Midgar. It paid no heed to the airship as it passed by overhead. It had just one goal in mind, and all of its attention was focused solely on completing its task. The airship circled it once, as the crew took it in, before they turned south and sped off towards Midgar. The plan was simple. They would land the airship a few miles outside of Midgar. Cloud and his friends would disembark, and the Highwind crew would move the airship to a safe distance to avoid attack. Cloud's crew, meanwhile, would wait for Weapon to arrive on land. When it reached them they would strike, and defeat it before Shinra had a chance to use their new weapon. It took only 10 minutes for them to reach the eastern continent. They spent a few minutes or so scooping out the area before landing the airship at the top of a small rise 5 miles from the perimeter of Midgar's furthermost border. After checking their weapons and materia, they began to disembark. Before leaving the airship, Cloud took Cat to one side. He asked Cat if he would be willing to sit out of the upcoming battle and monitor the situation within Shinra. Cat said he was only too happy to stay behind. Once Cloud and the others had left, the Highwind took to the air again. Although the crew's orders were to keep the Highwind at a safe distance from the battle, they remained close by, wanting to keep an eye on what was happening below. With the Highwind safely out of the way, Cloud and his companions turned their attention northward. They could see Weapon even from here, growing larger as it waded steadily through the water towards the continent. It took Weapon only a matter of minutes to reach the shore, and it began to make its way across the land. Cloud unhooked the Buster's sword from the strap across his back and hefted the heavy blade onto his shoulder. Behind him he heard the others ready their own weapons. Immediately after there were numerous flashes of light, as the companions called upon their summons. There was Shiva and Ifrit, Ramu and Odin, Titan and Leviathan. The summons gathered behind those who had called them, each one of them ready for the battle ahead. Cloud raised his fist and called on his own summon materia. The red ball flashed red and a ball of light was fired into the air. The light grew and then shattered like glass, releasing the dragon that was contained within. One of the most powerful of the Bahamut-class dragons, Bahamut Zero, was much sleeker than the rest of his brethren. His body was slender, with finely toned muscles and a layer of scales the color of onyx that appeared so fine they seemed like ordinary flesh, and yet were harder than diamond. 6 long wings protruded from the dragon's back. They beat the air as the dragon plowed upward into the sky. Diamond Weapon stopped at the foot of the rise. It looked up as Bahamut Zero soared and then turned in mid-flight to make a swooping dive toward the ground close to where Cloud and the others stood waiting. Weapon's eyes passed over them. It must have known they were waiting to fight, for it suddenly roared angrily. The sound of Weapon's almighty roar shook the ground. The monsters that were prowling the area turned and fled towards the mountains in the far south. Yet Cloud and his friends remained unmoving, refusing to budge even as Weapon tried to use its overwhelming might to terrify them into submission. Weapon was terrifying, of that there was no doubt, but that would not stop them from stopping its advance. Sid turned to Cloud and said,
"I'll ask again. You sure we can beat this thing?"
Behind Cloud, Ifrit roared angrily in response. The beast scraped his large feet on the ground, churning up the dirt in his eagerness to attack. Ahead, Diamond Weapon was no longer content to wait and stepped forward.
"Only one way to find out,"
the swordsman replied. He raised his arm and then lowered it, signaling the attack. As soon as the signal was given, Ifrit dropped down onto all fours and began to storm across the grass toward weapon. As he passed the companions, Tifa leaped up onto his back. She wrapped the trailing ends of the beast's long, fiery mane around her fingers and held on tight as Ifrit charged, carrying her to weapon. Seeing Ifrit approach, Diamond Weapon lifted its large, flat foot and stamped on the ground in an attempt to crush Ifrit beneath it. The beast dodged sideways before leaping up onto the monster's leg, digging his claws into the thick, hard flesh. Ifrit then ducked his head down and began to concentrate all its energy. The beast's body grew brightly, and then an earth-shattering explosion racked the air. Diamond Weapon roared in pain as flames engulfed its leg, causing it to stagger back. Just as the flames exploded, Tifa took her chance and jumped off Ifrit's back. The force of the blast propelled her up and carried her through the air to the glowing red globe in the middle of Weapon's chest. The young fighter clenched her fist and hit out with all her might, intending to smash it into pieces. Unfortunately, she could not get anywhere near it, for her knuckles rammed hard into an unseen barrier that suddenly rose up to protect the globe. As though in retaliation, that same invisible force lashed out and sent her flying back. Tifa hit the ground hard. She rolled through the dirt, the ground, and sky blurring as one as she tumbled over and over. Eventually, she came to a stop and a shadow flew over her as Vincent, sitting astride Sleipnir, jumped over her. Sleipnir galloped across the ground towards Weapon. Vincent drew his gun and began to fire at Weapon, trying to draw its attention towards him. His diversionary tactic worked. Weapon turned to follow the horse as it ran by. The monster leaned over and tried to snatch them up as they came within range, but the eight-legged stallion turned swiftly, keeping just out of Weapon's reach. The moment that Diamond Weapon turned its back, Odin and Sid, standing together, both raised their weapons and hurled them through the air. Sid's spear clanked innocuously off the back of the trailing cloak of armor that protected Weapon's rear. Meanwhile, Odin's lance, thrown harder thanks to the summon's greater strength, landed in the cloak and stuck there, embedded in the armor. The lance glowed bright and then exploded. The sudden blast knocked Weapon forward and it stopped, smoke and flames riding behind it. Sid crossed his arms and looked up at Odin.
"Don't you be getting cocky now,"
the pilot warned, only half serious. Without response, Odin crouched down and then jumped up high into the air. The pilot looked at him in confusion, wondering if he had somehow offended him. Then Red 13 bounded up and leaped onto Sid's back, pushing the pilot face down into the dirt. Weapon's fist then sailed overhead, narrowly missing them both. When the fist passed, Red 13 hopped off the pilot's back and Sid raised his head, coughing up dirt.
"How about you don't get distracted?"
said the Hound. Before Sid could reply, the Hound darted forward, with Titan running close behind him. Weapon roared. The globe in its chest glowed bright as it charged up its main weapon. Knowing from experience what was coming, Red 13 and Titan split up, running in different directions. Weapon finished charging its laser and fired. The beam hit the ground where the two had been standing, ripped the ground open, sending clouds of dirt and smoke and fire into the air. The beam traveled upward, tearing up the ground as it went. The rest of the companions, who had been waiting for a chance to strike, were forced to flee as quickly as possible as the beam traveled past them. The ground erupted beneath them and sent them flying. Cloud hit the ground and quickly scrabbled to his feet. The air around him was hot and scorched his throat until it was dry. The extreme heat and the flames from the blast zone sucked up the oxygen in the air and left him gasping for breath. His vision swam, and spots danced in front of his eyes. He needed to get away from the inferno before the oxygen was used up completely.
"Cloud! Over here!"
Cloud turned, half staggering, and looked behind him. Through the haze of smoke he saw Yuffie heading towards him, riding upon Leviathan's back. The serpent dived down through the smoke and burning air and flew low, his belly skimming the ground. He flew past Cloud, who forced his air-deprived body to jump up onto the serpent's back. The serpent then headed up and burst out of the thickening smoke, soaring above the flames. As they flew above the flames, Cloud took in deep gulps of air. His throat was sore, burned by the heat, but he could not think about that. He scrabbled across the serpent's back until he reached Yuffie, noting that her face was pale.
"You all right?"
she asked him, glancing over her shoulder as he sat down behind her. Cloud nodded his head in reply and then looked down at the battlefield. There was a long line of flames along the dried-up earth, and smoke was billowing into the air. The others were scattered about, trying to surround Weapon and attack it from all sides, working alongside the summons. As he watched, Titan ran in front of Barrett and caught one of Weapon's hands as the creature tried to knock the former resistance leader sideways. The flames were still burning. A strong wind was beginning to blow, fanning the flames. Leviathan circled Diamond Weapon and then flew swiftly north towards the ocean. The serpent swooped down low and glided over the ocean's surface, and when he soared he brought the water with it. Leviathan screeched, almost deafening his human riders, and headed back towards Weapon, carrying the water with him. The serpent came to a stop over Weapon. He flew in a large circle around the water that he had lifted from the ocean. The water began to churn, following the serpent's movements. When Leviathan increased his speed, the water did the same, spinning faster and growing tighter. A whirlpool formed in the center, spinning rapidly. When he was ready, Leviathan screeched and dived straight down. He descended quickly, his body twisting in a tight spiral. The water fell with him, still churning and still spinning, following the serpent's movements as his body twisted around it. Hearing the roar of the water, Diamond Weapon looked up. At the last instant Leviathan pulled away. He released his enchantment on the water, which plummeted down toward Weapon. The water struck Weapon with enough force to shatter a large building. Tifa and the others on the ground had to brace themselves as the water hit the ground and caused it to shake violently. Spray filled the air and fell like heavy rain onto the companions. Water surged around their feet as the water fell away from Weapon. Despite the immense force that Weapon was hit with, it seemed to be unharmed. Leviathan returned to level flight back in the sky. On his back, Yuffie and Cloud opened their eyes. Yuffie's face was paler still, and also a little green.
"Hey, you!"
she called out to the serpent with a shaky voice.
"Next time you do that, let me get off first."
"Ugh." She keeled forward, clinging to the sea dragon's mane. Leviathan simply screeched in reply, and Cloud had the distinct feeling he was laughing at her. His musings were broken when Bahamut Zero suddenly flew past them, startling the serpent and almost knocking Cloud and Yuffie off his back. Yuffie shuddered and clamped her hand over her mouth, cursing under her breath about arrogant dragons. It was lucky for her that Bahamut Zero did not hear her, and the dragon kept on flying upward. Ramu was on his back, kneeling down and surveying the battlefield, his staff in his hand. The old man then stood and raised his staff above his head. Lightning began to crackle around it, and Ramu threw it towards the ground. Weapon reached out a hand and caught the staff as it zipped by, much to everyone's surprise. The monster looked at the staff for a moment and tilted its head to one side. Then Weapon closed its fist around the staff, crushing it in its grasp. Yet as everyone's hopes fell, Ramu simply smiled. The old man clicked his fingers. A tremendous explosion rent the air around Weapon's hand. Weapon cried out in pain and confusion as lightning flashed up and down its body, electrifying it. The electric shock caused the monster's muscles to turn rigid, making it impossible for Weapon to open its fingers and release the weapon that was causing its pain. The water that covered its body only served to further enhance the strength of the lightning. This was the true intent of Leviathan's attack. With Weapon momentarily frozen in place, Barrett raised his gun arm and fired a series of rounds up at the globe in the monster's torso. The bullets bounced off the invisible barrier, doing no damage to it at all. Red 13 bounded past Barrett and dived onto Weapon's ankle. The flesh here was softer than anywhere else and his teeth sank straight in. The hound jerked his head, but the flesh was too tough to tear. He did do some damage, though, and his mouth was filled with the bitter taste of Mako. Even so, the wound was a superficial one, barely even a scratch to a creature the size of Weapon. This fact was proven when Weapon, outraged, reached down and brushed his hand against his ankle. He swiped Red 13 off in one swift, easy moment, sending him skidding across the ground and into the arms of Odin, who rushed in to catch him. Diamond Weapon turned and began to head towards them. Odin, carrying Red 13 over his shoulder, leaped back out of the way just as Weapon's foot slammed into the ground. The armored warrior moved quickly across the ground, running from side to side to avoid Weapon's grasping hands. All of a sudden Weapon stopped and its attention was drawn to the ground by its feet. A patch of ice had formed on the grass, and it was growing larger with every second that passed. The ice thickened and grew larger. It spread over Weapon's left foot and grew higher to encase its entire leg. Weapon tried to move its leg but found that it could not move. The ice was so strong that it was not able to break free. Weapon raised its head and looked at Shiva, who was standing nearby. The maiden's arms were raised in front of her as she used her power to trap Weapon in a shell of ice. Once one leg was firmly trapped in an unbreakable casing of ice, the maiden turned her attention to the monster's right leg. Frost began to form in patches along the diamond-hard flesh of Weapon's thigh, growing and spreading down to its ankle. Seeing the ice forming, Weapon roared and endeavored to break free before both of its legs became trapped. It twisted its hips and tried to lift its feet off the ground. The ice held, but Shiva was feeling the strain. The ice's growth slowed, and cracks began to appear in the ice's white surface. Shiva's brow furrowed and she closed her eyes tight, drawing upon every last ounce of her power to keep the ice together. Tifa could see Shiva struggling to maintain the ice's strength. At any moment weapon would break free. Realizing this, Tifa turned to Vincent, who was riding close by on Sleipnir.
"Vincent!"
She called out to him.
"Give me your materia."
Vincent shook the ice materia out of his gun and threw it to Tifa as he rode by. The young fighter caught it and turned to weapon. Holding the ice materia out in front of her, she added her own energy to Shiva's and aided her in reinforcing the ice. The growth of the ice increased and the cracks began to heal. The ice spread up weapon's leg and over its torso, heading for the globe at its center. Meanwhile, weapon continued to strain against the ice, even as it rose up around its waist and spread up onto its chest. When the ice touched the barrier protecting the red glove, the creature roared in anger. Sparks of red light began to flicker around the globe as the ice spread over it. The beam fired, and the ice broke apart with a loud crack. Giant chunks of ice from its waist and right thigh were thrown away and went hurtling towards the ground. One chunk narrowly missed Vincent and Sleipnir, who galloped quickly out of the way. Another chunk headed towards Ifrit, who was about to charge. The ice hit Ifrit, and the fiery summon was thrown back and hit the ground hard. He rolled and eventually came to a stop. The beast tried to stand but failed, and flames swept over his body as he returned to the world from where had been summoned. One large piece of ice shattered when it hit the ground, sending a cloud of icy shards as sharp as glass sweeping across the land. Tifa raised her arms to shield her face as dozens and dozens of tiny ice fragments hit her. They cut into her arms and legs like thousands of tiny daggers. Her skin burned with an icy cold, but was quickly warmed by her own blood as it trickled from the many tiny wounds. Shiva was too exhausted by her efforts to trap weapon to defend herself. The ice cloud struck her with full force, and she fell back to the ground. Her body crystallized into a statue of ice and then, like Ifrit, she too vanished. Weapon started to turn and wrenched its left foot off the ground. It then slammed its foot down, breaking what was left of the ice that was holding it. The ground trembled as the lumps of ice hit the ground and tumbled across the hillside. Sleipnir galloped between the chunks as they rolled by, and Leviathan dived down to bat the chunks away with his tail. Sid picked up his spear and hurled it at a piece that was heading for Barrett. The spear's point cleaved the ice, which fell away and stopped rolling. Once again, weapon slammed its foot into the ground. It leaned down and tried to snatch Red 13 from the ground, but the hound, with his more agile body, leaped easily out of the way. Realizing that snatching was not going to work, weapon clenched its fist and struck downwards in the hopes of crushing the hound instead. Red 13 saw the shadow fall over him and he looked up to see weapon's fist heading towards him. He froze, and would have been smashed into the ground if Titan had not at that moment shoved him out of the way and caught hold of the fist seconds before it hit the ground. Weapon's eyes flashed in annoyance at this interference and began to press down with all its strength. Titan struggled and pushed back, though it would not be long before weapon's superior strength overcame him. Red 12 scrabbled back to his feet and turned to Titan.
"That's enough,"
he howled.
"Titan, withdraw."
Titan grunted through gritted teeth. The summon materia in Red 13's hair clip glowed bright and Titan disappeared. With Titan gone, weapon's fist smashed into the ground, going at least 2 meters deep into the dried out soil. Up in the sky, Leviathan continued to survey the battlefield. Cloud held onto the dragon's scales as he leaned over. He watched as his friends attacked weapon from all sides, while weapon attempted to literally stamp them out. Their weapons were easily rebuffed by weapon's armor. Only the summons seemed to do any damage, as he saw when Odin threw his lance and pierced the armor of weapon's thigh. Green Mako trickled from the open wound, and weapon bellowed in pain. Cloud turned his attention upward. Until now, Bahamut Zero had been keeping out of much of the battle, waiting for a chance to strike. The dragon saw his chance when those below pulled away as weapon fired a shot of blue energy from its mouth. Bahamut Zero tilted his wings and fell into a steep and speedy dive. He zipped past Leviathan once again, causing Yuffie to shout at him and headed for weapon. The dragon slammed his body into weapon, striking with more force than the Genon cannon. The impact pushed weapon back about 50 meters to the edge of the rise. At this point weapon recovered from the initial shock and dug its claws into the ground, holding firm. It gripped weapon's shoulders and tried to shove the dragon away, but Bahamut Zero clamped his powerful jaws into the creature's shoulder and refused to let go. The two were locked in a standoff, each pushing against the other, waiting for one to weaken and relinquish the fight. Not content to stand around and wait for the dragon to weaken, Diamond Weapon opened its mouth. A faint blue light glowed in its throat as it gathered up Mako from the pit of its stomach to fire at Bahamut Zero. Seeing this, Cloud grasped Yuffie's arm.
Tell Leviathan to get down there,
he told her sharply. Yuffie did not hesitate and called out to Leviathan. The serpent obeyed her without question and dived down towards Bahamut Zero and weapon. Pulling up at the last possible moment, Leviathan zipped over Bahamut, just close enough for Cloud to jump off. He landed on Bahamut and began to run across his back towards the dragon's neck. When he reached the neck, he drew his buster sword and leaped into the air, just as weapon fired a single blue shot at the dragon's undefended back. Grasping the hilt of the buster sword, Cloud swung it with all his might in a swift, upward stroke. The edge of the blade hit the energy shot and cut straight through, cleaving it into two. As the blade came through the other side, the two halves separated and went firing off in different directions, landing in the ground on either side of Bahamut. Cloud kept on moving. He reached up with one hand and caught the edge of the armored plating at the top of Weapon's chest. The swordsman pushed one foot against the creature's torso and pulled himself up onto Weapon's shoulder. He looked up and saw Weapon's diamond-eyed gaze looking at him angrily. Cloud raised his sword and brought it down upon the joints of Weapon's neck. The blade cut deep into the armor, and Mako oozed out of the wound. He struck again, and again, cutting deeper each time. Angered and in pain, Diamond Weapon raised one hand and knocked the swordsman away. Cloud went flying back, losing his grip on the buster sword, which spiraled away from him. Seeing his summoner fall, Bahamut released his hold on Weapon and jumped back. Cloud crashed into the hard, metallic leather of the dragon's foremost left wing and rolled down until he landed with a thud on the dragon's back. Now that it was free, Weapon opened its mouth and fired a series of energy shots at the dragon in front of it. The shots ripped through the dragon's 6 wings, leaving giant, gaping holes in their wake. Another hit the dragon's right flank, burning the skin and muscle, and dark blood came oozing out of the wound. The sickening scent of burned flesh filled the air as smoke rose from the dragon's wounds. One final shot hit Bahamut Zero in the side of its face. At this the dragon screeched in pain and fury. He reared up on his hind legs, clawing at his wounded face. As he reared up, Cloud lost his grip and went sliding down the dragon's back, falling off the edge of the dragon's hind legs and landing on the grass. The swordsman rolled as Bahamut Zero's foot stamped down on the grass close to him. He scrabbled back out of the way and looked up at the dragon. Bahamut Zero tried to open his mouth and fire his main weapon. A hot glow began to rise in his throat, but all that came out was a rising column of steam. This effort put Bahamut Zero in even more pain, and the dragon, outraged by the assault, began to thrash about wildly. He no longer cared about his summoner's safety or the safety of anyone else on the field. All the dragon cared about now was to smash up anything and everything that got in his way. His tail lashed and hit the ground near to where Barrett and Red 13 were standing. Another swipe of that tail almost sent Vincent and Sleipnir flying. All the while Weapon stared, mouth open and glowing, watching silently as the dragon thrashed. Realizing that the dragon's presence was now a threat to them, Cloud took the summon materia out of his gauntlet and lifted it up above his head. The materia flashed once, and the dragon vanished in a shower of light. Cloud struggled to his feet. The buster sword lay a few feet away, embedded in the ground after Bahamut had stamped on it. The swordsman staggered over to it and bent down to pick it up. A sharp pain went up his arm as he lifted it, and he dropped to his knees, holding his arm. Tifa ran over and put her hands on his shoulders, but he waved her away. He forced himself to his feet and held the buster sword out in front of him. He could not succumb here, not until Weapon had fallen. With a great effort he raised his sword, preparing to charge forward. It seemed he did not need to, for Weapon was no longer trying to attack them. The monster had closed its mouth, and the pulsing glow of the globe in its torso had faded back to a dull, constant light. Weapon's head was turned up towards the sky, and its eyes were moving this way and that, seemingly searching for something. The creature stepped back away from Cloud and the others, but it was no longer interested in them. Something else, it seemed, had drawn its attention. One by one the others cautiously lowered their weapons. They watched as Diamond Weapon's head turned sharply southward. Its eyes calmed, and the monster turned away from the companions and began to make its way slowly across the ground, making the ground shake with every step. Cloud lowered his sword and ran forward. He stopped before a patch of churned up earth and watched as Diamond Weapon stomped away from them. The edge of its shadow passed over him, and he covered his eyes from the afternoon sunlight. His eyes turned in the direction of Midgar, where Weapon was headed. There were storm clouds moving in from the south, heading in their direction. Something about them gave Cloud a very uneasy feeling in his stomach. No, it was deeper than that. It was a feeling that he felt in his very soul. He sheathed his sword and watched the clouds. Sid came to stand beside him.
What's wrong?
He called up to Weapon, irritated.
It's like you're blowing us off.
Cloud returned his gaze to the landscape before him, and to Weapon, who continued to walk in the direction of Midgar.
No, it's feeling something,
he said. He shook his head and looked back up at the black storm clouds. There was definitely a strange yet recognizable feeling in the air.
Yeah, it senses murder.
Around him, the others shifted uncomfortably. They were tired out from the battle, their bodies battered and bruised. Yet even in their tired, bruised state they too could feel the sense of murder in the air. It was thick and pungent, like a bad taste they could not swallow. What was this feeling, and whose murder were they sensing? Leviathan landed a few meters away, and Yuffie jumped off. She ran to rejoin the others, while Leviathan, Odin and Ramu, the only summons that remained, shimmered and vanished, their powers no longer needed.
Okay,
said Yuffie, face pale and hopping anxiously.
Can we go now?
Cloud nodded. He did not know how, but somehow he knew that it would be dangerous to interfere with Weapon now. They had done all they could. Their assault had been all but ineffective. Now they could only hope that Shinra's new weapon would be enough to stop it. Everyone turned and began to run back along the grass. The high wind was already moving in to pick them up, landing at the top of the rise. Cloud paused to take one last look at Weapon. The monster had its back to them and was still making its way towards Midgar. He hoped that Shinra's new weapon would be enough to repel it, otherwise Marlene and all the other innocents in Midgar would be in grave danger. Still, he could not worry about that now. They had done all they could. He was about to turn and follow the others when the PHS suddenly rang. Cloud pulled it out and flipped it open. He had no sooner opened it than Kat's shrill voice came screeching out at him.
Oh no! Let's hurry out of here! Something big! I'm talking really big's coming.
End of chapter. Episode 35, Part 13, Chapter 33. Chapter 33. Rufus paced about his office, impatiently waiting for news on the cannon. He had been told that Weapon had arrived on land, and he also knew that at this moment Cloud and his friends were out there fighting it. At first Rufus had toyed with the idea of sending a patrol of soldiers out to aid the fight, but decided against it. Let Weapon play with the rebels. Every second it wasted on them, Rufus reasoned, the more time they had to finish their preparations. Rufus stopped pacing and looked out of the windows of his office, formerly his father's. There were storm clouds heading in from the south. He could see them already, thick, black, heavy clouds rolling in, the air broken by a few rumbles of low thunder. The untimely arrival of this storm concerned him. It was reportedly going to be one of the biggest storms Midgar had seen in about 7 years, though the details on the true nature of the storm that day was kept firmly under wraps, and not even Rufus knew about it. Worse, the storm was heading straight for Midgar. Finally the intercom crackled. Rufus turned away from the window and approached the desk, resting his fingers lightly on it. Heidegger's deep, irritating laugh came bellowing through, giving Rufus the news that he had been waiting for.
Mr. President, preparations for the Sister Ray are now in order.
The intercom crackled again, and Scarlet's high-pitched, cackling laugh echoed through, cutting over Heidegger's voice.
Any time is fine,
she said. Rufus started to reply, but then he paused and shut his mouth. His fingers drummed on the edge of the desk. Like Reeve, the president had his own concerns about this plan, though his were more focused on whether or not the Mako shells fired by the cannon were strong enough to reach the northern continent. An almost impenetrable barrier protected the North Crater. The cannon, the Sister Ray, was Shinra's last attempt to break through and take out Sephiroth. With Sephiroth gone then Meteor would disappear too, or so they hoped. But if the shell failed to break through... Angrily the president clenched his fist and slammed it into the table. There was no room for doubts now. They were pouring everything that they had into this weapon. He had to believe that it was strong enough to do the job. All he had to do was give the order to fire. Rufus turned back to the window. His fists were still clenched. The president ignored the fast approaching storm and looked out at the city.
Fire!
On Rufus's command, the Sister Ray sprang into life. The many levers along the side of the cannon began to swing up and down as the cannon entered its primary phase, which was to draw all the Mako out of the reactors surrounding Midgar. White and blue warning lights lit up along the length of the cannon, and a siren began to wail from below, warning all those still gathered outside to run for safety. Only the soldiers guarding the Shinra building's entrance remained outside, headphones over their ears to protect them from the upcoming blast. On the city's outer edge, the top of reactor number 2 opened up. Mako energy surged up from inside and gushed up into the air. Its green glow illuminated the darkening sky and cast an eerie glow on the sector below. The Mako was scorching, with most of it rising in clouds of hot steam, though some droplets fell like rain onto the city below. The number 3 reactor followed suit, opening up and releasing its contents into the air. The number 4 did the same, and the number 5, and so on, until all 7 Mako reactors were lit up like beacons around the city. The glow of the number 7 reactor fell spookily on the remains of Sector 7, making the wreckage appear even more dark and desolate. Inside, valves opened up in the reactor cores and released the thousands of gallons of Mako that had been stored for productive use. The Mako surged down the pipes attached to the valves, leading to the reactor's exterior and from there to the sister ray itself. 3 of those pipes led straight into the barrel itself, collecting the Mako in a chamber at the back to be formed into the shell. The remaining Mako in the 4 other pipes was fed directly into the power station at the back of the cannon. This would generate the force necessary to fire the shells all the way across the ocean. When the last of the energy had been siphoned out and into the cannon, the clouds of Mako that were spewing from the tops of the reactors ceased. All power to the city stopped, and the city was plunged into darkness. Every single light, TV, and machine went off. For the first time in its history, the city of Midgar was silent. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then sparks of light began to flicker around the end of the barrel. The light gathered and began to swirl in front of it, growing faster and faster until it became a churning whirlpool of energy. The numerous switches alongside the cannon flicked up into the on position. Every valve and container was thrown wide open, allowing the recently obtained Mako to flow freely throughout the cannon. The switches locked in place and turned in a clockwise direction, in time with the internal shafts that pumped the Mako through the cannon, increasing its power. When the power reached its max, the swirling lights were sucked inside the barrel, and then the cannon fired. The shot caused the cannon to recoil violently. The thunderous boom that came with the shot caused all the windows in the Shinra building to shatter. Thousands of deadly glass shards went tumbling down like rain towards the soldiers and civilians still gathered outside. Unlike the soldiers with their armored helmets, the civilians had no means to shield themselves from the falling glass, and so they dropped down to the ground and covered their heads or ran for the safety of the Shinra building. The Mako shell that was released went zipping off at more than 100 mph. It passed the borders of Midgar in a matter of seconds. It gained in speed until it was traveling at just over 200 mph across the withered land. The shell glowed white-hot as it moved, and it was churning up the dry land as it whooshed northward, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. It showed no signs of slowing, and powered onward. Rufus, in his office, smiled and ran a hand through his hair. Everything was in motion now. All he had to do was wait and let the shell do the rest. Diamond Weapon came to a stop at the very edge of Midgar's outer perimeter, where the withered land came to a stop. It turned in the direction of the city, its eyes focused on the horizon where Midgar stood. It paid no attention to the high wind, which was flying along steadily behind it, keeping at a safe distance. A slit appeared in the front of the wing-like protrusions sticking out of Weapon's massive shoulders. It spread from end to end, and the wings opened up, revealing a weapon the monster had not yet used. The inside of his shoulders were filled with a barrage of biomachine guns, powered from Weapon's very own life energy to release an unstoppable volley of energy shells. On its torso, the armor partially covering the globe in the center opened up. Embers of yellow light began to gleam around the globe and around the bioguns in its shoulders. When it was ready, Diamond Weapon spread its palms. Its eyes narrowed and it opened fire, releasing several glowing missiles in quick succession. These missiles shot through the air at high speed. Cloud and his companions stood on the High Wind's outer deck. As Weapon opened fire, they all rushed to the edge of the railings and leaned far over, watching the shells as they zipped away from them.
Which direction is it going to attack from?
Tifa shouted. Her voice was barely audible against the unending roar of the wind.
Midgar.
Red 13 called in reply. Barrett's eyes widened in fear. He leaned even further over the rail and reached out with his good arm, though he was helpless to stop the shells as they headed to the city where his daughter was still held captive.
Marlene.
There was nothing anyone could do to stop the shells. They had already disappeared over the edge of the horizon. All they could do was cross their fingers and hope. There was one cross-section where the paths of the energy shells and the path of the sister ray's Mako shell collided. Some of the energy bullets fell right into the Mako shell's path, and on contact the bullets flashed and disintegrated, burned up by the intense heat. Many others, though, made it through and carried on towards Midgar. Undeterred by the collision, the Mako shell continued north. Diamond Weapon's shoulder guns closed, and the monster waited. Its body was perfectly still, not even its eyes betrayed any signs of movement. The high wind flew above it at a safe distance, but Weapon was no longer paying them any heed. All of its attention was fixed on the land ahead. It seemed to be waiting for something. There was a long pause. Then, a blue speck of light appeared on the edge of the horizon. It was small at first but grew rapidly, moving at incredible speed. It was also directly in Weapon's path. The monster did not budge but instead braced itself as a strong wind began to blow around it. The light belonged to the Mako shell. It struck Weapon right in the middle of its chest. It shattered the barrier protecting the red globe and went straight on through until it came out of Weapon's other side. Impaled on the beam, Weapon found itself being lifted off its feet and driven forcibly backwards. The monster was carried about 20 meters before the Mako shell finally broke through Weapon's back, releasing the creature and continuing northward, still undeterred. Diamond Weapon hit the ground hard. The Mako shell had burned a giant hole in its chest that covered much of its torso. The red globe had been burned away, the only glow left now was the red-hot glow of its burning flesh and muscle, a sickening sight to behold. Weapon roared in agony as it hit the ground. The monster bounced once off the ground and then hit the earth again. The ground shook each time it landed. Weapon skidded a further 10 meters down the countryside before it finally came to a stop. The monster twitched and then fell still. It did not move again. Its eyes, though, were still bright, gazing up at the darkening sky. Up on the high wind, the companions were in awe by what they had just witnessed. Awestruck and horrified. Weapon was a mighty, terrible creature, and yet, somehow, to see it lying there with a great, smoldering hole in its chest made them feel sort of sad. As they watched, the lights of Weapon's eyes died out. Trails of Mako began to rise from its body as it started to return to the planet. Tifa covered her face with her hands, unable to watch any longer. The last traces of Diamond Weapon faded away. Barrett stepped back away from the railing. "Damn!" was all he could say. Red 13 shook his head.
"It went right through Weapon."
Cloud leaned over the rail again. He looked north. There was no sign of the Mako shell. He frowned, confused. If the weapon was designed only to repel Weapon's attack, then the shell should have been destroyed on contact. If that was the case, why had it carried on moving? Where else could it be heading? The answer then came to him, and realization dawned in his eyes.
"I see,"
he said.
"They're after Sephiroth. The crater on the northern boundary."
Once again everyone leaned out over the rail, wishing that they could see that far north. By the time Cloud and the others realized Shinra's true intent, the Mako shell had already crossed the ocean and was zipping rapidly across the vast, icy mountains of the northern continent. Now traveling in speeds excess of 250 mph, it sailed over the mountains towards the northern crater. Since the events at the northern crater, when Sephiroth had used the black materia to summon Meteor, the entrance to the crater had been sealed off. To ensure that no one interfered with his plans, Sephiroth had created a barrier around the entrance, making it impossible for Shinra or anyone from getting anywhere near. The barrier repelled any attack that Shinra could throw at it. The Sister Ray was the company's last shot at breaking through and stopping Sephiroth from destroying them all. The shell left the last of the mountains behind and sailed over the thick forests and icy plains surrounding the crater. The barrier was just ahead, a glowing white arc over the surface of the crater. The shell slammed into the side of the barrier. On contact, a thunderous explosion rent the air, causing the entire northern crater to shake down to its foundations deep beneath the earth. The air was filled with a blinding white light as the shell caused the barrier's exterior to crack, and bolts of electric energy danced over its surface. The light faded. The barrier shimmered. And then disappeared. Rufus stood by the broken window of his office, waiting, still impatiently, for news on the outcome of the cannon's attack. The Mako shell should have reached the northern crater by now, he thought. He looked out at the cannon. The Sister Ray was now in the process of being powered down. As the power was restored to the reactors, lights began to come on all across the city. Finally, the intercom crackled. "Sir," said an operator. "Heidegger and Scarlet must be busy aiding in powering down the Sister Ray," Rufus thought.
"Weapon's been defeated. The barrier has disappeared."
Rufus turned from the window and walked back to his desk. He looked up at the ceiling and sighed. So their risk had paid off after all. And better yet, they had managed to take out one of the planet's weapons at the same time. A smile passed over Rufus's face. It seemed that they had not needed Cloud and his gang of rebels after all. The Shinra company was more than capable of defending itself. He was just about to relax when the intercom buzzed once again. The smile vanished from Rufus's face. The operator's voice, filled with panic, came trembling through.
Sir. A mass of high-density energy is heading towards Midgar.
Rufus spun around to face the window and looked out at the city. His body went cold, and his breath caught painfully in his throat. It couldn't be. Just as the operator had said, a number of large energy shots were hurtling across the sky towards Midgar. Although weapon had been defeated and had returned to the planet, the shots that it fired did not. These high-density energy pellets now began to tear across the city like miniature meteors, lighting up the darkened sky. The citizens who had gathered in the streets after the city became dark watched the sky in captivated terror as dozens of energy pellets rained across the city.
WHOA weapons attacking. Run for your lives.
All at once the people scattered and began to swarm the streets of Midgar as fear and terror finally took hold of them. The sight of meteor in the sky, the thunderous boom of the cannon, and now the arrival of the energy pellets above the city finally snapped whatever shred of composure and self-restraint the people had left. They ran over each other, trampled and pushed past one another, and screamed in complete fear as they ran to escape the city. Yet as they quickly discovered, the exits to each of the sectors were still sealed off. There was no escape. Luckily for the panic-gripped citizens, most of the pellets were much too high to hit any of the smaller buildings and homes and as such sailed harmlessly overhead. The larger buildings however, such as the Shinra building, were not so lucky. Rufus watched in silence as the seemingly endless bombardment of energy pellets soared past his office. It should be said that Rufus was strangely calm despite the situation. He did not run or scream or cry like the rest of the panicked populace of Midgar. That was not the way of Rufus Shinra. He watched as an energy pellet struck one of the lookout towers at the side of the Shinra building. The tower exploded into flames. Clouds of thick, billowing smoke rose into the air in front of Rufus's office. The president watched as the smoke cleared, and then looked straight ahead. There was another energy pellet approaching, and it was heading straight towards his office. Rufus watched it draw near, his eyes stern and unflinching, showing no fear. He had been wrong, after all. It was not Shinra who would defeat Sephiroth and save the planet from meteor. No. That duty now fell to Cloud and his friends. It was up to them to stop Sephiroth now. Perhaps it had always been their duty, and Shinra had simply paved the path for them to follow to achieve that goal. The energy shot hit the Shinra building just below Rufus's office. It detonated on contact, shaking the building down to its foundations. A wall of blistering hot flames surged through the office's broken window, rapidly turning it into a blazing inferno. The force of the blast sent Rufus careening backwards. He raised his arms to shield his eyes as the extreme heat of the flames swept swiftly through the office. Behind him, the desk and chair were thrown back and crashed onto the floor. The flames continued to spread at an unbelievable speed and blocked the two main stairwells, the only exits. Rufus Shinra, president of the Shinra company, was trapped. End of chapter.